You sure you've got time to waste on me? Shida asked, with a slightly glum tone that also carried traces of bashfulness, as she lightly peeled away from Koko once the two of them had made it to her and James's cabin. Obviously she had asked for this, and she was very glad that Koko had agreed to come along with her. However, with the election having finally concluded just minutes ago, and everything that had happened just before its conclusion, she was more than aware that the already considerable workload that the commander had on her shoulders was most likely about to skyrocket to unknown heights. And not only that, Shida also more than clearly remembered the dressing down she had gotten not too long ago, when she was temporarily stripped of her rank, and just how done with her shit Koko had truly been in that moment. Well, hers and James's. However, while both certainly couldn't claim to have really improved their behaviour on the noticed points since then, James wasn't really here to take any of the heat for it right now. Therefore, after having a moment to think about it, the feline wanted to at the very least make sure she wouldn't put even more pressure onto Koko's mood by accidentally forcing her to deal with something which she felt should be far lower on her list of priorities right now. Lacking an answer so far, Shida slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and continued speaking. I mean, I'm solitary and all that. If you've got something better to do or want to go see James or something, she began to say, though she didn't get any farther than that before she was cut off by a hand, planting itself on top of her head, laying right over the line between her hair and her forehead. Her eyes widened and ears stood up at the sudden touch, her social senses briefly throwing her for a loop, as she didn't recognize this as any of the typical human gestures. And among Miat, this would have been a very clear sign to shut up, even if the gesture would have had to be much more forceful than it was. Still, she paused in the middle of her sentence, looking up at the standing commander, with big, unsure eyes, while her tail began to slide left to right over the bedsheets, causing a crinkling noise that appeared pretty loud in the suddenly silent room. Koko's green eyes looked back into hers for a long moment. Her expression was pretty unreadable, and she inhaled deeply before letting the breath out in a slow and controlled manner. Gently, her hand began to rub left to right, her fingers causing a rustling sound to spread right through Shida's skull, going straight into her ears, as the individual strands were compressed and then released. Although she was still very confused by the situation, Shida found herself enjoying the warm feeling of Koko's palm against the skin of her forehead. She didn't know if it was the warmth itself, or maybe the simple fact that there was contact, but whatever it may have been, after the insanely stressful day, and, in all honesty, days, she had, she found, a light sense of comfort slowly spreading through her. After a moment, she had closed her eyes, blocking out the light of the world so she could focus more on the reassuring touch. After another moment, her chest began to rumble in the deep start of a purr, her tail swishing over the bed faster by the moment, all the while her ears remained perked up, waiting for Koko to break her silence and reply to her question. Despite the pleasantness of the gesture, the conditioning of Shida's mind caused her to still be 100% ready to be rejected at any moment. Though that also didn't keep her from subtly leaning into the touch, pressing her head and face up into Koko's petting head. There were many scenarios in which Shida found herself behaving like a human's vapid house cat, despite many similarities. However, right now she cared little for any senses of pride or dignity, and she found herself simply letting go and following what her instinctual nudges told her. As the feline released a somewhat satisfied hum into the touch, Koko finally decided to speak up. "Don't be stupid," the commander mumbled, though any admonishing effect the words may have had were entirely lost through her low and affectionate tone. "I'm not going to push you away when you're actually asking me for help." Slowly, she pulled her hand away, leaving Shida to briefly miss the contact, though she hadn't quite sunken to the level of whining about it yet, as her eyes opened to look up at Koko once more. Koko's earlier unreadable expression had mellowed out, now showing an empathetic visage with a very gentle smile on her lips. With her hand still slightly lifted, she moved it to the side to gesture to the space next to Shida. "Mind if I sit with you?" she requested, and Sheeta quickly scooted aside just a little bit while nodding and smoothing the sheets next to her with a wipe of her hand. Following the wordless invitation, Koko smoothly slid down next to Sheeta, sitting close enough that the sides of their hips touched as her weight slightly pressed the mattress down. Set contact was then enhanced even further when the commander gently leaned to the side, pressing shoulder on shoulder against Sheeta, causing immediate warmth to spread through their arms. There was a moment of silence as they both settled into this new position. Eventually, Koko was the one to break it. "I'm glad you asked me to be with you," she said, her tone sounding earnest as she spoke, even as she looked down to their knees, instead of turning her head to look at Sheeta. Koko's hands laid on her own knees, gently stroking her thumbs along their sides as she carried on. "I don't know if it is or isn't progress, or if you maybe just have a weird day, but I'm glad." Moving her head a bit towards Koko in an invitation to lean against each other even more, Sheeta exhaled as she took in those words. "I wish I knew too," she murmured, not really sure if she felt like this was any progress. This was the sort of stuff she usually did with James, so it wasn't really out of the ordinary for her. But if Koko felt that this was different, maybe there was something to it. After a bit of thinking, she tilted her head just enough to look at Koko's face from the corner of her vision. "Should we watch the inauguration?" Koko shrugged against her shoulder. "Do you feel like watching it?" she replied, her head mimicking Sheeta's movement, bringing her eyes up to return Sheeta's gaze. As an immediate reaction, Sheeta also shrugged her shoulders, not really wishing to impose any of her feelings onto the decision at first. But then, just a moment later, she slowly shook her head. "Not really, to be honest," she admitted, her earlier slightly bashful tone returning. Koko gave a gentle chuckle as an answer, and ever so slightly nudged against Sheeta's shoulder, before finally accepting yet another wordless invitation and leaning her head against that of the feline. "Me neither," she admitted as well. "My excitement for it is pretty much gone." Once again, a long moment of silence emerged between them. "Do you know if Sky is okay?" Sheeta carefully asked a few moments later. She knew that technically she wasn't exactly entitled to be privy to such information, and she half expected Koko to tell her as much. However, while Koko certainly wasn't a rule breaker by any stretch of the imagination, outside of breaking social rules, she also wasn't exactly the greatest stickler for procedure either. "She's shaken, but fine," the commander therefore answered, without raising a big fuss about Sheeta's technical civilian status. "Took her a bit to come to terms with being turned into a walking bomb. She also refused to eat for a while, but luckily that problem was quickly solved by giving her some laundry to fold. Not exactly pristine code of conduct, but I doubt anyone is going to drag us to court over it." Sheeta tried to give a courtesy chuckle, but all that came out was a slightly amused-sounding huff. Though, right after that, her face turned even more glum than before. "I don't know why I'm even still surprised, but I never expected him to sink quite so low," she said. The grip of her hand on her knee tightened slightly, though despite the topic, her claws never threatened to emerge from her fingers as it did. Koko moved her own hand over to lay it on top of Sheeta's. "You're less angry than I would have expected," the human stated honestly, while giving the back of Sheeta's tense hand a gentle rub. "Yeah," Sheeta confirmed, honestly feeling very similar. Considering past experiences, she should have been blindingly livid after something like that. "Maybe I'm too bewildered to be angry right now. I mean..." She moved one of her hands back on the mattress and briefly pulled away from Koko slightly, as she leaned her weight on it, allowing her head to fall backwards in the leaning motion and looking up at the ceiling. "Turning a child into a..." she began to say, though didn't quite bring herself to let the full scale of the infraction over her lips, huffing and shaking her head instead. "Who does something like that?" "Sadly, more people than many would like to think," Koko informed her, with a tone that was saddened but also nigh frighteningly sober and experienced. Following Shida's example while taking it a step further, Koko fully fell backwards onto the bed, only keeping her head up by carrying some of her weight on her elbows, lifting her shoulders just above the sheets. Almost as if this has suddenly turned into a competition, Shida then pushed the laying back one more step as she lied fully down, laying her head down onto her crossed hands. "I don't even know who that man is anymore," she established, in a brief moment of pure awareness as she stared up at the ceiling. Koko nodded. Shida could tell that a comment was burning on the commander's lips. However, it seemed like Koko decided it would be better not to say it out loud. Instead, she soon changed the topic slightly. Seemingly unable to entirely contain her curiosity, she carefully asked, "What about James?" Shida glanced at her. The look that Koko had on her face as she asked clearly indicated that she did not think that asking was a good idea by any stretch of the imagination. Still, Shida found herself not all too emotionally stirred by it. There was a brief pang of hurt and worry, but at this point she knew that James would be right back on his feet in little time, thus easing any too strong reaction she may have otherwise had. "Most of the people who hurt him are already dead," she replied, after a few long breaths had gone by since Koko asked the question. "And he's still hurt." She paused for a second, listening to how her own words sounded back in her head. Then she nodded. "Groundbreaking stuff, I know," she gently chided herself, realizing that what she said sounded a bit like something you would hear as a moral in a children's show. But the main part I wanted to get at is that they got what was coming. Koko nodded, apparently deciding to finally just take Shida being in surprisingly not terrible spirits about things, allowing silence to return for far longer that time. She still looked at Shida with an empathetic yet curious look, but it was clear that she had resolved to allowing Shida to talk about what she wanted to, instead of trying to get any deeper understanding of her current mood. Shida was indeed thinking all kinds of thoughts as she lay there, not entirely sure she wanted to talk about any of them. Though, after a bit, one certain thought suddenly emerged that very much piqued her interest. A very sudden, very out of context, and very not exactly appropriate thought. One that this most certainly was not the moment to speak out loud right now. Therefore, obviously, that was the first thing her mouth did before her brain had the chance to raise an objection. "Hey, can I ask something about you and James?" she blurted out, fully rolling her head over to make eye contact with Koko. Koko's face turned surprised for a second, and then morphed into a slightly leery expression that very clearly wondered about some things. Despite that, her tone was still candid, as she replied, "Sure. I mean, I genuinely don't think there'd be anything he hasn't told you about us yet, but ask anyway." By now, Shida's brain in fact did have the time to put in an objection. However, that same brain then quickly retracted it, deciding that it was in too deep to pull back now. When she had already shoved her foot this deep into her mouth, she may as well commit. Thus, it was entirely without hesitation or uncertainty when she asked, "Do you ever think about doing it again?" Koko raised her head and even pushed herself up a couple of inches, as she looked down at Shida in a mixture of surprise and concern, having clearly expected many questions, but not that one. "Shida," she said, in a tone that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be appalled or appeasing, coming out slightly breathless in conclusion. "I know I joke around a bit, but I'm not one to—" However, before she could fully explain herself, Shida pulled one hand out from under her head to stop her, while also rolling onto her side a bit more. "But, if you had the chance—" She pushed her question further, now suddenly smelling blood and feeling like she needed to get an answer out of this. She didn't even know why. She didn't feel like there were any stakes attached to this information, other than her random desire to know. But that desire was strong. Like, without hard feelings? Koko released the breath she had held since she was interrupted, slowly, and her eyes narrowed at Shida. Now her expression turned into full-on suspicion, as Shida assumed that the human social conditioning took over, making the commander assume that Shida had some sort of mate or partner protective reason to ask about something like that. Though she had yet to really face it herself, she had heard that the topic of former intimate partners could be a touchy one for humans, even if she herself didn't quite get it. In any case, she remembered James to have a pretty similar reaction to this when she had asked him about his exes. Koko scrutinized Shida for some more time, apparently really feeling the need to get a very good grasp on the situation before making any comment on the matter. Shida just looked back at her with curious eyes, by now itching for the answer for no reason other than the random thrill of it. Ultimately, Koko briefly closed her eyes, releasing a very short breath while the suspicion wiped from her face. She kept her lungs empty for a moment and shifted her lips left to right as she thought about the prospect. Finally, after taking in just enough air to answer, she mumbled, I guess I wouldn't say no. However, then, her eyes almost immediately opened up with a very sharp gaze, looking almost strict as she much more firmly added, But really, only if there was no baggage. I joke around. I do like to have fun, but I am not about hurting feelings. Instantly chuffing in amusement at her words, Shida reached out her hand, reassuringly patting Koko's upper chest, the parts where humans didn't mind being touched. I know you're not, and James wouldn't either, she stated outright, hoping that she could do away with any notions that she had asked, out of a sense of lingering jealousy. Still, that's good to know, for future reference. Although her suspicion remained at bay, Koko clearly had no idea what Shida could mean by that, though she probably also didn't see any sense in asking. If you weren't suspended right now, I should have you run laps for that, she ultimately scoffed in exasperation, though a gentle tint of colour on her face indicated that her mind may have gone to some odd places as she pondered Shida's words. Shida smirked back at her, already opening her mouth to make some retort about things having silver linings, though the thought died on her lips, as she was quite suddenly overtaken by a moment of nostalgia. She couldn't pinpoint where it came from. It was an odd combination. Partly it was the feeling of Koko's uniform beneath her fingers. Partly it was the strict and slightly enervated, yet still deeply amenable tone that Koko had taken with her. And partly it was the sheer absurdity of asking a strange question, completely out of context, and getting scolded for it, or still getting a straight and honest answer all the same. In this manner, it wasn't something that had happened very often to her. She could probably count on both hands how often, in fact. However, so far, it had only ever really occurred with one person. Feeling another slight pang, Shida lifted her hand to press it against her chest. A thought that was just as impulsive as the one before consumed her mind in an instant, and once again she spoke her next words without truly thinking about them. Though when she had blurted out her previous context-devoid question in a hasty manner that simply wanted to get out, this one gave itself more time on her lips, the words refusing to leave them in anything but a deeply sincere manner. I know I'm not exactly in any position to ask for a favour at the moment, she established at first, still knowing very well of all the problems she had caused. Koko stopped her scolding and looked up, very clearly picking up on the tone in Shida's voice, as she was immediately paying full attention to what her friend had to say. But, Shida went on, knowing Koko wouldn't allow herself to be pressured no matter what, so there was no risk of overstepping a line by simply asking, Do you think you can maybe help me get into contact with someone? I think it's better if you do it than asking a Veselon. Koko blinked a couple of times, seeming a bit surprised by the apparent ease of the request. Still, a moment later, she nodded slowly. Of course I can, she confirmed, seeming not the slightest bit interested or worried about just who Shida may wish to talk to. Judging by her tone, she was going to make it happen, one way or another. The new official Galactic Council's inauguration, the first one that had happened in at least 100 of Earth's years, was guarded like no second event would be. After the open attacks that had occurred right on the former Acting Council's doorstep, especially the ones on one of the most important candidates there were, and the Council's specifically invited guest of honour, nothing short of an army had been mobilised to once again bolster the already raised defences. Despite many calls of foul play on both sides, some of which went so far as to say that the humans clearly tried to assassinate their own candidate to stir conflict, none of them were able to even sway the idea that this was a moment too historic to allow it to even be remotely sullied by any interference. Well, any more than it already was. With him being among those candidates who had garnered the highest total number of votes for themselves, James's absence was certainly felt, as the galaxy's new government was sworn in front of the people's awaiting eyes. People awaited for this moment for a multitude of reasons. Some had looked forwards to his encouraging words, now that he would presumably have the necessary power to make the change he promised to fight for. Others were waiting for him to drop his mask, now that he had finally gotten what he wanted, finally revealing his true, vile colours, as he started his designs to plunge the galaxy into a dark age. And yet others had simply anticipated the moment when he would finally make good on his words to turn himself into law enforcement, so he would be dealt with. Ultimately, nobody outside of those who truly hated his guts were really satisfied, as the, for better or for worse, single most impactful councilman of the newly emerging order had to be excused on stage, since he had not yet recovered from the injuries he had sustained from the attempt on his life. Of course, those who had run in the election along with him were doing their best to make up for his absence, and of course the attempt on his life was given much attention in every one of their acceptance speeches. But ultimately, everyone could tell that the mood was rather oppressive. Not completely surprisingly, but also not entirely expected considering just how large of a percentage of the vote James could win for himself. Not every single one of James's companions had made it into the council in the end. For reasons that the participants themselves could hardly explain, Losarana had fallen far behind everyone else in the votes department, leaving him as the sole outsider, who had to watch the inauguration from a place away from the main stage, along with those who had not taken candidacy, though the Pixameria didn't complain. If he was honest, he didn't quite disagree with the assessment of the galactic voters. He probably wasn't cut out for this, like many of the others were. Instead, he decided to cheer and holler along with all those who celebrated, as the many very first truly official Deathworld Council members were placed onto their seats, completely without the hidden influence and pressure of those who deemed it a useful point in time to allow such a thing to happen. Still, it was worth remembering that those who were actively opposing them now had been the ones who had originally set this landslide into motion. They had wanted James on the council, and by the stars they had gotten him. Him and a whole bunch of problems. And since the inauguration speeches were encouraging, but also far from anything that nobody had heard a lot in recent times, the new council's first conference facing off both old and new members against each other soon began behind closed doors, leaving large parts of the station on half lockdown as platoons of guards and soldiers kept everything under absolute control. And, of course, that order also included a number of long overdue visits that needed to be made to people who had enjoyed the protection of their undenied candidacy so far, now that they were no longer candidates. Nia scowled deeply as she looked at the screen displaying the news as she walked into her cabin, with Tuya already waiting for her inside. The lieutenant acknowledged the arrival of her girlfriend with the quick flash of a smile, though her own gaze also soon returned to the screen. At the time, the news were displaying drone footage of a large ball of people that had formed around a singular man in its middle, packing itself tighter and tighter as its outer edges were approached by a large force of law enforcement from all sides. "How is he?" Tuya asked, clearly wishing to offer her attention and support, despite the things that were happening in the news. "He'll live," Nia sighed, a bit exhausted, as she dragged herself over to fall down next to her partner. It's a good thing he's had as much work done as he did. She moved to push up against Tuya a bit. Tuya in turn quickly took her hand. Glad to hear it, she started, with a sigh of her own. Gave us one hell of a shock with his stunt. Could have ended real ugly if he hadn't acted as quickly as he did. One wrong move with that last... Tuya's words were interrupted by a sharp inhale, as Nia pinched the lieutenant's arm in displeasure, giving her a clear indication that she did not need any more details about just how closely her brother had danced with death this time. Her more shocked than hurt outburst quickly shifting into a light snicker, Tuya patted her girlfriend's shoulder in appeasement. Sorry, she quickly excused herself. The morbid talking point sort of came naturally to her, especially since she talked to her team so much recently. Then her lips shifted a bit as she focused back on the screen. Look at those losers, she mumbled. She had deliberately turned the volume off as she was following the ongoing arrest, but she could clearly see from the footage how the lunatic in the middle of the people was ranting and raving, while the officers slowly but surely pushed their way towards him, laboriously dispersing the crowd that was trying to act as living shields for the washed-up ex-councilman. I hope not too many get hurt, Nia mumbled, as she settled into her new position. I'm amazed that you care, Tuya replied in a grumble. Stuff more in a bag, take a bat, and you always hit the right ones. Nia finished the sentence for her with a sigh. They think the same way about us. But we don't do shit like that, Tuya countered and nodded at the screen, seeing how more and more of the people had to be basically dragged aside. Admittedly, she didn't actually like a scene like that all too much herself. Seeing what was essentially police dragging people away always left a bitter taste in her mouth. But still, in this case, her sympathy well had run dry. Do you know if anyone asked for James already? She rolled her head a little to look over at Nia. Nia nodded. Yeah, but honestly they were pretty understanding about his situation. Said he should call in as soon as he was fit enough for questioning, she explained in empty, evenly paced words. I don't think they're even going to take him in. I mean, there's really no risk of him running away, and I think they know that. They also told Konglorch it would be okay if he came by a bit later. Tuya nodded. Good, she said. Would be a bitch to try and protect him while he's locked away. Suddenly, Nia turned her head, pressing her face into Tuya's shoulder and hiding it away. Tuya looked down at her head in mild concern, while she felt Nia's warm breath spread through the fabric of her sleeve. Can we turn that off? Nia soon asked, her voice slightly muffled given her current position. Of course, Tuya replied, taking one last glance at the officers pushing deeper into the crowd, on their way to finally shut the old tortoise down, before extinguishing the screen with a gesture. Once that was done, she fully turned to her girlfriend, gently running her hand over the back of Nia's woven hair. Hey, she said gently, placing a kiss on Nia's head. It's going to be fine. All those people, they can finally be put to justice now. Nia let out a long breath, once again warming up Tuya's shoulder. Then, when she lifted her face again, her eyes were starting to wetly shimmer, leaving some reflective blotches on her dark skin right under them. I just... Why does he have to play the hero? She lamented, briefly butting her forehead against Tuya's shoulder, before fully lifting her head up again. He's always been like that. First he breaks the rules, and he suddenly thinks they're important when it's actually bad for him. She huffed deeply. Tuya rubbed the side of her neck awkwardly. Well, he wants to set a good example, I guess, she mumbled, though admittedly she also wasn't really sure why exactly James was so dead set on turning himself in. Sure, what he had done wasn't right, but considering everything else that had happened, it was barely worth a footnote at this point. He did say it was for something he did more for himself, though she had never quite gotten behind what he meant by that. Admittedly, that may also be because she was still one of the people around him that ultimately knew him the least in comparison. Things briefly turned quiet before Nia intensely looked at Tuya again. "Hey, can you promise me something?" she asked directly, causing Tuya to sit up a bit straighter. "I don't know," she replied, just as outright as Nia asked. In her line of work, promises she could make were a rare thing, and those she could keep were even rarer. And as far as Nia was concerned, she really didn't want to make any false ones, even if they may have been what Nia wanted to hear. Nia nodded in understanding, her lips offering the faintest hint of a smile at the honesty. "It's just one thing," she assured while sitting up, grabbing Tuya's hand to place it between both of hers, holding it tightly as they looked deep into each other's eyes. "Just promise me that you will never, and I mean never, think that I am going to hate you if—" She paused briefly. Clearly what she wanted to say was very important to her, but actually saying it still took a lot out of her. Still, with a deep inhale and a shuddering breath, she finally managed to get it out. "If you ever can't save James." Tuya's face scrunched up, worry instantly spreading throughout her as to the reasons they may have brought on the request for such a promise. "Babe," she began to say, but Nia quickly shook her head, new tears gently flowing from her eyes as she lifted Tuya's hand up. Still holding it between both of her own, she slightly parted them as she brought her girlfriend's hand to her lips, kissing it gently. Tuya felt a flutter of mixed feelings in her stomach at the gesture, but she momentarily swallowed the rest of her assurance to allow Nia to speak. "James is one of, if not the most important person in my life," Nia said, her eyes almost asking for forgiveness as she said it, and her hands closed around Tuya's a little tighter. "He did so much for me, so many things, that no one else will ever be able to do again." She sighed and clearly needed a brief break, lifting Tuya's hand up to kiss it once more. She then made the most intense eye contact that Tuya had ever experienced in her life, as she continued. "He helped me so much to become the person I am today, and I will never be able to fully repay him for it," she elaborated further, her voice shaking slightly. "I never want to lose him, but—" She needed to take another breath before she could continue speaking. "But despite all of that, I want you to promise that much to me. I'm sorry if this seems like I think my opinion is more important than it is. I know it may be something you would have never worried about in the first place, but just, if it's any concern to you, please promise me. Promise me that you know that much." Tuya stared back at her. She needed to digest that for a moment. Just, where the hell had that come from all of a sudden? Still, despite her confusion, she took Nia's feelings to heart. Wherever they came from, they were clearly incredibly sincere, and she had to treat them with the respect they deserved. So, she looked into herself, thought deeply about what she would do if a situation where the thought of that scenario may have made a difference to her, exploring herself for how she would feel and react. Then, finally, she nodded. "I promise," she said firmly, before wrapping her arms around Nia and pulling her into a tight hug, which Nia gladly returned right away. As they stopped in front of the heavily secured door, the two Zadiatos bulls wearing the yellow identifiers of the communal military gave each other a long look. Wordlessly it asked, "Are we really going to do this?" Of course, neither of them had an answer, as both were asking each other, but in the end there were no two ways about it. They had their orders, and damn it, they were going to fulfill them. Still, a quick game of cross-branch cut decided which of them would have to be the one to do the talking. Shaking their rolled-up trunks 2 times in front of each other, they quickly snapped them open into their respective shapes. The slightly smaller of the two bulls celebrated internally, seeing as his colleague-turned-opponent had thrown out the Y-shaped twig form, while he himself had picked the clearly superior X-shaped cut. His celebration, however, was short-lived, as the door they were standing in front of swung open, long before either of them actually had the chance to fully acknowledge which of them would have to take action, meaning they were standing with their game trunks still extended, right as the massive form of Nafmir Duralfren appeared within the opened entrance. As the aspirant for the highest title a ball could ever wish to embody looked down at their extended trunks, the two soldiers quickly retracted them before lifting them in respectful O shapes.
"Good day to you, Nafmir Duralfren,"
the smaller of the two quickly stammered, even though he had technically won their little game. The Nafmir gave them a cold, calculating look for a couple of seconds, so clearly judging them that it hurt. Then, finally, he pulled his gaze away, turning into the room he was blocking and lowering his head.
"I believe this is for you,"
he announced, and slowly stepped back, in turn allowing the slightly smaller and rounder, but certainly no less imposing figure of the High Matriarch to appear. Well, if making a fool of themselves in front of a Nafmir was bad, this was the true meltdown.
"Congratulations to your re-election as Supreme Leader, High Matriarch Tuya,"
both bulls quickly announced, standing stiff as a board while their ears flapped wildly. The High Matriarch made a slightly amused noise and gestured for them to calm down.
"Thank you very much,"
she said, before tilting her head slightly to muster the both of them.
"But that is hardly what you came here for, is it?"
Both bulls swallowed heavily. However, ultimately, the smaller one of the two once again manned up as he replied,
"We have to ask you to accompany us to the precinct, ma'am."
Although they both tensed as they awaited her, as well as her protector's, reaction, Tuya simply smiled.
"Of course,"
she said, not hesitating to take the first step out of the door to go with them.
"Far be it from me to obstruct the works of justice."
She only briefly turned to the Nafmir to look at him.
"I will leave my abode in your capable trunk," she declared in a sweet tone that nearly made both of the young bulls swoon, though they managed to pull themselves together.
Just about.
"Success to you."